Hi Julia, your recipes for a sweet life. You know I love 3D cookies, so when I got to thinking about what 3D cookie I could make for Christmas, I did what I usually do, which is I look around my house at all my everyday objects to see if something strikes my fancy that could be cookified. So I actually rooted through my Christmas stuff and I came across this retro vintage little Santa cookie jar, which I just love in all of its chubbiness. And I thought, hey, I think I can do something with a lot of my domed molds by turning them in various directions to make a chubby Santa Claus, or a Mrs. Santa in this case. I thought Mrs. Santa was typically underrepresented at Christmas, so I thought I'd make her into a cookie instead. So today I'm taking this inspiration and turning it into this three-dimensional cookie right here. Yes, this is all a cookie with some royal icing and fondant accents. So let's get started and talk about the cookies we'll need for this project. It's actually a 9-cookie project and it's rather involved, starting from the bottom to the top. 2 squished oval feet. These are just ovals that I smushed after cutting them with a standard oval cutter. 2 rounds, and I'll have all the dimensions in the video description that are going to get stacked and form a little support on which they will rest on the feet like so. And this will elevate her skirt. This is about a 4-inch round that's going to go under the skirt to sit on top of that. And then we get into domed pieces that are a little bit more unusual, and I'm going to show you how to make one of them in the next segment. We've got a big dome here. It's about a 4-inch dome that's going to form her skirt. We've got a smaller, about 2 3/8-inch dome that's going to form the bodice of her dress. And then we've got 2, about 1/2 inch. By the time they're wrapped with cookie dough, they look more like an inch. 2 little pieces we're going to sandwich back to back to make her head. So those are the basic cookie components. In addition to the cookies themselves, we'll need royal icing for dipping. We'll need a flesh tone for the head. We'll need red for the body. We'll also need a little bit of white and green for detailing. Likewise, we're going to use a little fondant for some of the more dimensional elements, pieces that are easily plucked off if you don't love fondant, but they create nice, great shape and dimension. We're going to be using green for the bow on her skirt and her apron, as well as white to form some stamped pieces as trim at the base of the skirt and also as the collar. We want to keep that covered up so it doesn't dry, so I'm going to put it back in the fondant container. And lastly, I've got a lot of pre-made embellishments that we're going to be using to deck her out. Little spirals of gray royal icing for her hair, little fondant snowflakes for a headdress, little green dots to go on top of the headdress, which are royal icing. We've also got little royal icing transfer eyeglasses, little red granny eyeglasses. And then lastly, fondant embellishments for the apron, and also some royal icing and fondant embellishments that she'll be carrying. The cookie plates and cookies will hopefully be nestling in her hands, and I'll have a whole nother video that will address the cookies and the cookie plates. As for shaping the more tricky parts of this project, I will have all the dimensions and tools and everything in the video description, so don't worry if you miss anything here. It'll be down below. I am going to focus on doing the actual head. The method is the same for the bodice and also for the skirt, but let me just review quickly what you'll need for all 3 pieces. Skirt, remind you, is this 4-inch dome or hemisphere. It is cut by rolling a piece of dough flat, cut a 6-inch round, and drape it over a 4-inch cake mold. For the bodice, which is 2 3/8 inches, we're cutting it with a cutter that's bigger than the 2 3/8-inch dome that it goes over. That's the key thing to know. You have to cut a piece that's bigger than the diameter of the dome. In this case, this is probably closer to 3.5 inches, and it's going to be draped over the 2 3/8-inch dome. So let's move on to the head. Same process. We're creating these small 1-inch pieces, which I'm actually going to shape over a teaspoon. It's a teaspoon measure. It's a nice rounded hemisphere, but I'm going to be using a larger cutter to create the shape that we're going to drape over it. So for all these pieces, I do like to roll on my silicone mats that are lightly floured. They'll lift off really easily that way. And I roll them for contoured cookies, typically a little bit thinner than I roll them for regular cookies. Taking my 1.5-inch cutter, lifting it off. We can reuse all the dough we roll. If I were doing many more heads, I'd cut many more at one time. And then simply place it on the back of the teaspoon. For metal forms, I tend to dust them a little bit with flour. For silicone molds, I don't. They'll just come off that form a little bit better. And then I shape it around the piece. We want it coming all the way down to the edge or very close to the edge with very few cracks on the top. So I'm going to press out the cracks that I have. Generally, the thinner you roll it, the fewer cracks you'll have. And if there's any dough hanging over the edge, I'll take my paring knife and trim it back a touch because it will spread a little bit in the oven, particularly around this handle here so it doesn't create a foot if it spreads into the handle. It doesn't have to be perfect. We'll then place that on the back of the cookie sheet and into the oven to bake for its normal baking time, about 375 for a few minutes. This is a small piece, and then let it cool slightly until I can handle the spoon and then pop it off, and you'll be left with pieces like so. A little rough around the edges, but we'll file those edges for a better fit as we get further along in the process. That's the same process for shaping all the contoured pieces. So once the pieces are baked and cooled, you're ready to dip them. Dipping is the best way to cover a curved surface smoothly, in my opinion. I've got a whole nother video about how to do that. I'm just going to briefly touch on it here as it relates to the heads. The end goal are 2 head pieces dipped in flesh icing. I also did the exact same process, but in red for both the bodice and the skirt. For my dipping process, I just plunge the piece in head first. Make sure it goes very close to the edge. And then lift it up. And then shake it until it starts to fall off. I don't see any bubbles, so I'm not going to pop anything. I do have a little gap here where my hand was holding it, so I'm going to cover that with icing. Then you want to set it on something so it'll drain. In this case, this is a really small piece, so I'm just using a coupler from a pastry bag, setting it on a piece of cardboard so I can move it more easily. And then I'm just going to rest it on there and allow it to drip off. Having dipped everything and let it dry, we're now ready to begin the assembly of the bottom part of the Santa jar. And I like to get it all elevated and on its feet before I start detailing it so there's room for the skirt scallop pieces to fit and hang below the bottom line of the skirt. The 2 feet I sponged with black, so they look black along the sides, and then just simply top coated them with green royal icing. The other thing we want to do is prepare our skirt for placement on its base. And it's nice to file the bottom edge. As I mentioned, after dipping, there'll be some roughness to the edge. So recall the big round, which is about 4 inches, is a support to go under the skirt. But I don't want any of that brown to show in the final construction. Chances are it won't because I'm hanging some scallops over it, but just in case, I did spray it with my PME pearl spray, which makes it look a little silver. You could also sponge it with white food coloring, either is possible. Or use a sugar cookie there that would be a natural white color anyway. But I'm going to work with a sprayed version and simply glue the piece we just sanded onto it with a little bit of thick royal icing glue. Again, my royal icing recipe will be linked to in the video description. And the glue is the thickest consistency that I typically start with. The thicker it is, the faster it dries and holds its shape. So we're going to get the skirt up on this piece. It extends over it a little bit, which is okay, because we need some room to hang those scallops. Now the next step is getting the little riser glued together that piece that I just constructed is going to sit on. And oftentimes I'll sand these too to make sure they're completely level. Sand the bottoms of them. And I'm just going to stick them together with a little bit of glue. Like so. Once they're relatively dry, you can do a number of things to finish them off. I just wrap them with a little bit of a fondant ribbon that I textured with a tracing needle and some dots. Again, this piece will be barely visible, but just in case, you can see it sneaking out from underneath her skirt there. There is a seam on the fondant ribbon, so that's going to be the back of my piece. I definitely don't want that facing forward. So once that's dry, I'm ready to begin to put it on the feet. So I'm just going to make sure my nicest points of my feet are facing out, because they will sneak out a little bit from underneath her skirt. And then we're going to stick this piece on top with the seam in the back, probably like so. Let me just get it situated first and make sure it's level, and then I'll stick everything together. So it's going to go together like so. And for a little while, it might need a little bit of support in the back, because as you'll notice, I'm actually gluing this not dead center on the feet. I want the feet sticking out in the front a little bit. So it's a little bit wobbly in the back, and I might need to support that with a little bit of paper towel until it dries in place. But for now, I'm just going to put a bunch of my icing glue here. I'm using white just because if any peeks out, it's easier to clean off than some colored icing on top of the piece. That's pretty good. It's actually sitting pretty level, but just in case it doesn't, while it's drying, you can tuck a little paper towel under the back like so. I'm going to go ahead and glue this piece on with some thick royal icing. Make sure it's centered before you leave it to dry. And to do that, I'm looking at it front to back. It looks really centered this direction, but it looks way forward from this side. So I'm going to push it back. So now I'm ready to put some of the white detailing, all that beautiful scallop work and the lines that you see on her skirt. Now that this is a little bit dry, my first step is actually to take my trussing needle and kind of mark a rough center point at the top. So it was centered front to back, side to side rather, but it's a little bit, looking at it sideways, it's a little far back. So my center is going to be more like right about here. But I want to mark that because all my lines that I'm going to pipe are going to radiate from that center. And then I'm going to pipe 16 lines basically down her skirt. First I'll do the 4 quadrants and then I'll start bisecting the lines so that I get them roughly evenly spaced. I do this all by eye. You could certainly measure it out to be more precise. But all I really need is my starting center point, and usually I can get them pretty well spaced. I'm kind of letting the icing fall. I feel like and just guiding the tip. I feel that if I let it fall rather than drag it, it tends to be a little bit straighter. And we'll continue in this vein until I get all the lines down. Now I'll bisect those quadrants. So I'm going to finish this quadrant. I would do the same for the other 3, and then I'm going to show you how I detail some of the lines further. So again, I would complete that, do all the other 3 sections just the way I did this. But you'll notice some of my lines up here are a little heavier. They've got kind of a ruffled effect to them. And that's because once I did that, I went in to every other line and I did what I'm going to do now. I'm going to show it on the countertop. It's kind of what I call a trailing beaded border. I push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. And I'm going to do that on each side of the line so it creates kind of a braided looking effect almost. You want to give a little bit of drying time to these lines so you don't smush them. So push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. And I don't come all the way to the bottom because I want to leave room for scallops at the bottom. So I'm going to do about 13 or 14 of these. So I'm just going to complete the swags in these 3 areas and then come in and finish the fondant detailing at the bottom. So you'll get a sense of how I decorated the whole thing. So again, I'm working with that same outlining icing to create the swags, and I want a relatively straight one to start here. Again, kind of letting it drop on its own. And a similarly straight one here. Now the next line here is same process, except I'm going to let it droop a little bit more, let it fall a little bit deeper, and then bring it back up, touch down, make contact. And then before that icing dries, generally I like to pipe the little loopy pattern on it. So making contact, letting it drop down, coming back up, making contact. And just doing little loops like so all the way up. Got one more set here. This was a shallow line here, not as dipped as the one immediately above. So I'm just going straighter across. Now the next step is coming in once this is dried with this is all stamped fondant. So I've rolled my fondant to the number 3 setting on my pasta machine. And I've inked an uninked stamp pad with food coloring, just my regular red liquid gel food coloring that I use in icing. And I'm going to ink this cool stamp here with it by pressing it in the food coloring and then directly onto the fondant. To cut them out, I used a little 7/8 inch round cutter centered on each piece so I can get 4 out of each stamp press if I cut accurately, so that's 1. And then I took the back end of my number 804 tip, which is about 1.25 inches, to cut the top scallop piece, like so. And I'll do one more just to show you what I mean. And you want to give them a little drying time so you don't smudge the food coloring when you put them up on the skirt, and also so you don't stretch the fondant, but not a lot, because if you let them dry too much, you can crack the fondant when you try to put it on top. So with those stamped, I'm going to attach them, and to do that, I work with corn syrup instead of royal icing. That way I get a nice flush contact point. Royal icing can be sometimes a little bit lumpy under thin ribbons. And so I am going to actually apply it to the skirt itself, just not very far up, because I want to make sure I cover all the corn syrup, and not very much of it. But that looks pretty good. Okay, we're going to start with the small piped green details first. For very small dots on a contoured surface, I'll pipe directly because they're not going to drip. But for very big dots like those, I'll use a royal icing transfer, because if I were to pipe a big dot like that on the sides, it would likely drip and not hold its shape. So I'm going to do all the tiny dots first, and then we'll stick on those transfers. Now I'm going to put a bunch of little dots along the edge of the scallop, barely touching, applying any pressure because I want them to be very tiny. Okay, and then lastly we stick on the transfers, and I'm going to stick those down directly on to the intersection between the two fondant pieces with a little bit of white icing glue, so that if any should sneak out from the sides, it's not so obvious. So we're ready to decorate the bodice. As a reminder, you do want to sand that one flat, as we did with the bottom of the skirt as well. You can see this one's nice and smooth. The other first step is to make sure that you've got a big enough hole to receive a toothpick in the top, because our head is going to be mounted on a toothpick. I actually started scoring the hole with my trussing needle, kind of twisting it in, and then when it was big enough, I got my toothpick in there and turned it around just to make sure it can slide through freely, and that looks pretty good. What I'm going to do is pipe a center line down the front for sort of the seam on our shirt, and then just 2 little arches to kind of simulate the curve of our arm. We're not going to actually attach big arms, but these are to be suggestive of our arms coming together in the center here, where she'll end up holding some cookies. And then we're going to finish this one off with some more fondant details. So starting in the center, let's make contact. Make sure it makes contact with the cookie, and then come down as straight as possible through the center. So for the arm, I'm going to start back here. I just want to make, the key thing is making sure they're relatively symmetrical. So I'm going to mark off the starting point on one side and also on the other side. So I'm starting at roughly the same point. So when viewed head on, the arms look like they're coming in symmetrically. And I'm going to start here, kind of curve up, and then kind of sweep in and lower towards the front as they, like so. And that completes the piping on the front of her. So I'm back with the same fondant that I had stamped for the scallop trim, except I'm going to use a different cutter, actually the narrow end of my number 804 tip now, to just select out the center of these stamp pieces to create the trim that's going down the center of her chest. You see I've already got most of it laid except for 1/2. So here's what I stamped out before. I think it's still soft enough for me to cut. It likes to stick in the tip, so I often take a soft paintbrush or a dull end of something and pop it out. And then we'll get 2 pieces of trim out of each by just cutting it in half. And then it goes down just as the scallop trim went down on the bottom with a touch of corn syrup. So just a little touch here. And we'll put that last piece on. And that's the exact same process I used to put all the other pieces down here. Now, if we want to, we can come back in with green dots to create buttons there. And these are going to be relatively small, so I'm going to go back to my icing in the cone here. And I'm going to keep the top relatively simple because her skirt's so complex. And you'll see she's going to be holding cookies, and I don't want her shirt to really interfere with the cookie plate. And just to give you an idea of how I did this beaded trim, the first step was to lay white beads, and then once those were somewhat dry, to come back in and lay green ones in between to get that double border. So I'm just going to fill in the few remaining holes on the back side of my bodice with more green dots, and that's it. Okay, my bodice and my skirt are drying, so I'm going to start putting the head together. You recall we dipped these earlier in the segment, and you want to make sure they're filed the same way the other two pieces were so they come together as tightly as they can. There's still going to be some lumpiness to them, but we're going to cover that with piped hair later. The other thing I've done is I've just filed a tiny little notch for my toothpick to clear the head, because we are going to anchor this on a toothpick. I try to avoid toothpicks in most of my cookie constructions, but in this case, it's helpful to have one because it'll make decorating our face a lot easier. I can hold it by the toothpick without it rolling around. This is my sandwiching technique where I just put icing glue, flesh-colored icing glue on one half, stick my toothpick in, and then sandwich the other half of the face on top. I'm going to pick it up, and I'm also going to reinforce and try to smooth out this groove in the middle by adding some icing around the seam. So here it is. Here's one completely dry I did a while ago. You can see once it's dry, you can freely move it around and hold it from here for decorating, which is quite handy. This is where we're headed, this little head here. So the next step is putting on hair and then her face. And I usually will add the snowflake and other head details once it's in the final assembly process. But just to give you a visual of where we're headed, let me start with getting the hair on. I've got one that has hair on already. And for that, I'm using my thick gray icing, starting at the center, and I'm actually kind of dragging and squiggling it down the side of her face, like so. We'll do that at least twice on each side. And then I'm probably going to put 3 more layers or lines down, the squiggly lines down the back to fill out her hair. And then pat down anything sticking out. And then that's pretty good. Now I'm using a charcoal black CK Products dust just to give her hair a little bit of highlight. You could leave it just like this, but this kind of accents the high and low spots a little bit. And so I've just put a little bit of dust here in the lid of the container. I want to shake off any excess, and then using a soft brush, whoops, I got a lot on there. You want to paint, you just want to kind of dust it on dry. That just gives her some highlights. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how you could add texture to hair, and that's completely optional. Now her glasses are nothing but royal icing transfers. As I mentioned at the start of the video, I have a whole nother video. It was a caterpillar video where I did little eyeglass transfers, and these are done very similarly with a wet on wet technique. So I'd like to put the eyeglasses lower than you might think, because when they're on there, I kind of want her looking down, so that's kind of cute. So for other facial details, I want to pipe a nose. I'm back to my flesh-colored icing, but slightly loosened. A little nose there. And I'm also going to pipe a little mouth that we're going to let dry, and then we're going to paint it with a little bit of pink. I'm just piping a little circle. And then as the last step, I want to put on her eyeglass arms. So we're just going to make contact with one side of her eyeglass. Just do a short little run on over to her hair. So we've got our little frames on. I do want to dust her cheeks, however, to give them a little bit of blush. I've got it working with a dry brush, just gives a really soft hue. So there, her face is almost done, except for the painting of her mouth pink, and you can see that's been already done on this one that we're going to use on our actual Mrs. Claus. So with our pieces all dry, we're ready to start stacking. And here's my front. And I'm just going to be using my white glue to locate this so that the front of the bodice and the front of the skirt line up like so. and make sure it's centered. So that's just a test placement. I'm just going to put a little white glue underneath in a few key spots and hopefully not have too much seep out. And make sure it's making contact with the cookie and it's centered from both directions. I might need a little bit more under here to make sure it's making contact. But I don't need a lot. That looks pretty good. So these ribbons are just going to fill out that little gap underneath between the bodice and the skirt a little bit. So I'm going to stick it down with a little bit of corn syrup there and just run it around the edge. And I don't really have to tack it midstream. I just need to tack it in the front and the back. It's usually enough. So that's all I'm going to do. Just make sure that free end falls in a way that looks kind of cute. That's going to be the back. Then we're going to put the other side down and tack it in the back. Now I want to work on the back of the bow a little bit before we go much further. I did pre-make some fondant bows, and in my ribbon video I talk about how to make those. And I'm going to stick it right in there with a little bit of, ideally it would be green icing, but I think I can get by with a little bit of white and have it not show. So just a touch there. And we'll plunge that into the back. Okay, now to put on the front of her apron, that piece that I previously cut down to size is just going to get stuck down over the ends that I left here, like so. So I've got some little hands from her that are really roughly shaped, like mittens almost, out of flesh-colored fondant, and they don't have to be perfect because they're going to be underneath the cookie plate. So I just want them actually bulky enough that they can hold the plate and just give the suggestion of a hand underneath coming out right about here. And I'm going to tack the first one. It doesn't have a thumb, but that's not going to be noticeable. Right about there. Again, sticking with my thick icing glue so that it holds the weight of this fondant is pretty weighty. Now you could give that a little drying time, but I think my plate that I'm going to stick on top of her is light enough that I could stick it on now without the hands falling off. So again, onto my white royal icing glue. So there, that's sitting nicely on those hands with just a suggestion of a thumb sticking out the bottom. I think that looks pretty cute. So now we're to the very last stage, which is putting on her collar and her head. Her collar is going to be a bit of fondant, which is going to be decorative. You can see it floating around her neck there, but it's also going to help to secure the head a little bit too. So to create it, I've once again stamped fondant in the same way that I stamped the little scalloped edge, but I used a different stamp. This one here with the red food coloring. And I'm using a 1 7/8 inch round cutter to cut out a round. The extra fondant can be balled up. It'll turn pink, but we can use it for something. And I'm going to cut a little slit here where there isn't a great impression so that that's not so obvious, and that will become the front opening of her collar. I'm also going to cut just a tiny hole with my cookie cutter here too, to leave some room to receive her head. So here's the head I did earlier. I just am going to orient it right about there and have her maybe looking down and off to the side like so, a little coyly like that. And to get that in place, I do need to go back to my royal icing. I want to make sure she's definitely secured. So I'm going to put a blob there. Not too much that it sticks out, but enough to keep that head on over time. Last few touches, I want to put another fondant bow underneath her neck. Okay, so we've got the bow in. I kind of like that. We're going to tuck up the back of her collar a little bit more on this side with a little more fondant so it meets her head a little bit better. And then we're going to stick her bun on, and then I think she's all ready for her holiday party. I think I want to put it slightly off center since she's looking to that direction. And there she is, all sweet. She'd of course need some drying time before you could lift her, but she's the perfect centerpiece to a Christmas table. Now, you might be wondering how I do Mr. Claus instead of Mrs. Claus, and I actually have given that some thought. My idea would be to take two domes and sandwich them back to back, stick them on similar feet, and use a similar head. But I'll leave that project till next Christmas. In the meantime, have a very happy holiday and live sweetly.